Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 82 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Before we get to our very special guest this week, I want to give a shout out and acknowledge some of the new connections I made recently in Barcelona. I was honored to be part of the first international training school on core correctional skills organized by the visionary Professor Ion Dărnescu from the University of Bucharest in Romania. I was privileged to meet probation officers and correctional officials from all over Europe, practitioners willing to learn how to be better at their craft from Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, Poland, the Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, and the Netherlands. It was an amazing learning experience for me as an instructor and hopefully for you all as the students. If any of you are listening for the first time, welcome to the show. As noted, we have a very special guest for you and all of our listeners this week. Dr. James Bonta received his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Ottawa in 1979. Upon graduating, Dr. Bonta was the chief psychologist at the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center, a maximum security remand center for adults and young offenders. During his 14 years at the detention center, he established the only full-time psychology department in a jail setting in Canada. In 1990, Dr. Bonta joined Public Safety Canada, where he was the Director of Corrections Research until his retirement in 2015. Throughout his career, he has held various academic appointments, professional posts, and he was a member of the Editorial Advisory Board for the Canadian Journal of Criminology and Criminal Justice and Behavior. He is a fellow of the Canadian Psychological Association, a recipient of the Criminal Justice Section's Career Contribution Award for 2009, the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, 2012, the Maud Booth Correctional Services Award, 2015, and the Community Corrections Award, 2015, bestowed by the International Corrections and Prison Association. Dr. Bonta has published extensively in the area of risk assessment and offender rehabilitation. His latest publications include a book co-authored with the late Don Andrews entitled The Psychology of Criminal Conduct, now in its 6th edition. He is also a co-author of the Level of Service Offender Risk-Need Classification Instruments, which have been translated into 6 languages and are used by correctional systems throughout the world. Lots more to talk about on these topics with Dr. Bonta, so let's get right to it. Please enjoy my conversation with the one and only Dr. James Bonta, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome to the show, Dr. Bonta. Truly an honor to speak with you and share our conversation with my audience. I normally begin my interviews by asking my guests to tell our audience a little bit about themselves and their background, but Truly someone who needs no introduction, James Bonta, the author of The Psychology of Criminal Conduct and one of the influences behind the risk-need-responsivity framework. I train and speak on the R&R framework quite a bit. I often tell folks how it all began with the book you co-authored with the late Don Andrews, The Psychology of Criminal Conduct, now in its 6th edition. Can you share with us what that conversation between you and Don sounded like as you were contemplating this collaboration way back when?
Well, let me just begin. Joe, thank you for the invitation to participate in this podcast. I hope the listeners learn something and find what we talk about of value in their work, whether it's research or in practice. The question about Don Andrews and I and our collaboration, I don't know if you're up for a story.
That's what we're here for.
That's what, okay, let me trace back our history a little bit more before the publication of The Psychology of Criminal Conduct, because I hope the listeners and you find it interesting how our collaboration started and the various people involved over the years. As Frank Cullen once said, the Canadian school, right? And I think I was born with horseshoes, you know where. I think some of my accomplishments or accomplishments attributed to me were partly due to luck. Yeah. Let me go back to, I think it was around 1975. Right? I came to the University of Ottawa to begin my studies on the PhD. Now, I was accepted into the child clinical psychology program, right? Child. My interest was in aggressive children, conduct disorders, youth, and their families. So I come to the University of Ottawa. I begin taking courses in child clinical psychology, and I very quickly learned that the way the program was set up was not a good fit for me. All right. My earlier background was more in experimental behavior modification. And the child clinical program at the time did not emphasize behavior modification, behavior therapy very much, if at all. So I was in a bit of a predicament. I wanted to switch to the adult clinical program that had more of the behavior, cognitive behavior therapy kind of stuff. The issue was I needed a PhD supervisor to accept me. Now, to get into the University of Ottawa, I had to write a kind of like a master's type thesis. It really wasn't that, because I had spent 2 years at the University of Toronto's Institute of Child Study, which was a diploma program, not a master's program. So I had to do a little bit of research, which was on juvenile court judges and their decision making. But I needed an external examiner. And as it turned out, that external examiner was Don Andrews. All right? Don was at Carleton University. Okay, now getting back to the requirement to have a thesis advisor. one of Don's best friends was a fellow by the name of Bob Waters, who was at the University of Ottawa. And he was a behavior modification guy, who we just hit it off immediately. So it was one of Don's best friends that got me into the PhD program for adults. And actually, my doctoral dissertation had nothing to do with criminal behavior. I taught sign language to severely autistic kids to see if it could help them remember things. Like we do self-talk, and using sign to do that. So my PhD had nothing to do with criminal behavior, right? So Don was my external advisor. Bob Waters, behavior mod guy, was my thesis advisor. And the time came, I loved being in school. School, I thought, was easy. You just sit there, you got nothing to do except read and listen to bright people. But my wife had other plans, and she thought that maybe I should look for work. And I agreed with her. Okay, good idea. Where do I start? So Don said, listen, I know the regional psychologist in the area, and I think they're going to be looking for someone to replace a fellow by the name of Steve Wormuth at the Ottawa Detention Center, right? Maximum security. Steve was 1 year ahead of me at the University of Ottawa. So Steve had a part-time job there, but he was finishing up, and he got a full-time job at a penitentiary out in Manitoba. So Don said, go talk to the regional psychologist and let's see what he can do. Well, do you want to guess who that regional psychologist was?
Do tell.
The regional psychologist was Paul Gendreau.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. So he was about 40 miles south of Ottawa. I go out to meet him. We talk. And when I got home, my wife said, Paul Gendreau called and you have the job at the detention center. I think that was a bad signal. Like, how can somebody get a job so quickly? And anyways, that's how I started working at the detention center. And Paul and Don went to school together. They did some work at the penitentiary in the Kingston area. So they knew each other for a very long time. Now, in the late 1970s, when I was working at the detention center, Don was doing consulting work for the probation in Ottawa. And that's when he started working with probation officers to develop the level of service inventory. And Don invited me to come to some of those meetings. I thought that this level of service inventory, there's something there. All of Don's work was in probation, so I decided at the detention center to start administering the LSI and doing research and follow-up on the instrument. And that, of course, brought Don and I closer together on the risk-need instrument. And around, I think it was 1980, Don was teaching a required course at the Carleton University called the Psychology of Criminal Behavior. It was required for all students who were looking for a criminology type degree. So the class was quite large, and it became even larger where they required someone to teach the evening course. And that's where I came in. I had a full-time job at the detention center. Dawn taught the day job. I taught the night course. And Dawn had at that point, what students were required to do was read a set of journal articles. Right? So it was reprints from what either Dawn wrote or other people wrote. Wasn't very particular. And as the years went on, I don't know how it came about, but we decided, well, instead of putting in these articles, let's just write a little chapter around it. And we continued building it. And what really gave us the push was when the university said, okay, if you're going to have journal articles in this set of readings, you need to get permissions from the publishers. And at that point, we thought, oh my God, that's going to be a pain. So we decided to write our set of readings into chapters. And those chapters then became the book. We got a publisher. It was Anderson Books at the time. And 1994, we published the first book. So it was over a period of maybe 14 years of close collaboration and talking about how we would organize this set of readings, how we would organize the chapters, how much information to provide. And for those who have followed the book over the years, you know that the first edition was not that large, right? I forget what it is, 250 pages or something. And then you get to the fifth edition, which was almost like an encyclopedia. I think it was 500 plus pages. And then in the sixth edition, which I wrote after a year after Dawn's death, then that was made smaller again. And hopefully I really tried hard to make it more readable and understandable. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've read both the fifth edition and the sixth edition. And to your point, I tell individuals that the sixth edition is much more digestible, if you will. And I make that point by saying, hey, there's even a Tony Soprano reference in the sixth edition. So it's really written more to the masses than to the academics per se. Of course, from that text came several principles. Most individuals, I believe, associate the psychology of criminal conduct with the principles of risk, need, and responsivity. But again, there were other principles in there, although those were the big three to come out. This programming has a rather diverse audience of students, practitioners, academics, even a lot of folks overseas who are sort of in the infancy of their probation. So to those individuals who are not as familiar with, again, those three major principles which came out of the text, that of the risk principle, the need principle, and the responsivity principle, could you speak to those three foundational principles for a bit?
Yeah, certainly. And once again, a bit of a background to that risk-need-responsivity model. In the 1980s, of course, there was a lot of people challenging the nothing works idea. and you had Paul Gendreau and Bob Ross writing reviews on this issue. And Don and myself and Bob Hogue also decided to take a review of the literature. And what we were trying to look for was patterns or into what is it about the treatments that work particularly well and the ones that don't. Can we associate a pattern to these findings? And this is where in 1990 we published our paper outlining the risk-need-responsivity model. There's a bit of a review at the beginning, and then we talk about the principles. And in that paper, we had actually 4 principles. The fourth one is the professional discretion principle. But everybody talks about the first 3. It's the one they're the ones that stand out, the ones that have the most research on it. And the risk principle basically says, look, it really matters who you treat, right? And who you treat are the medium and the higher risk offenders. The low risk offenders, they're low risk for a reason. They have certain strengths that they can overcome some difficulties largely on their own, maybe a little help here and there. But the high-risk people, they have a lot of needs, and they need more intervention. So the risk principle says, focus your services, your rehabilitation efforts on the medium to higher risk offenders. That's where you can make the difference. This is the pattern we saw in the treatment studies. The need principle, the important thing about the need principle is it makes discrimination between criminogenic and non-criminogenic needs, right? There were a lot of treatment programs that we looked at that, for example, focused on what we call non-criminogenic needs and made no difference in outcome, or it actually made matters worse, right? I used to, in my presentations, would make the joke that we had, especially among juvenile treatment programs, the juveniles have low self-esteem, so let's boost their self-esteem. And yeah, psychologists are good at boosting self-esteem, but in this situation, they just produce confident criminals. So, criminogenic needs, which are part of the central 8, that's what we need to focus on. So the need principle is what you treat, right? Your treatment goals, your targets. And the responsivity principle actually talks about how are we going to treat these people. So we have general responsivity that says we find treatment works best if you're using cognitive behavioral techniques of intervention rather than, some Rogerian psychotherapy or Freudian psychoanalysis. And then under responsivity, we do have specific responsivity, right? And this is where it's not a one-size-fits-all. Yes, use cognitive behavioral interventions, but really be attentive to the person in front of you, their emotional state, their personality characteristics, even down to the biosocial, like women, you may want to help them in a different manner than a male, or whatever. So be attentive to those factors. And of course, after the publication of that paper, we tested it out in our meta-analysis of offender programs published in Criminology that same year. And since that original paper, over the years, we have added additional principles. And I think now in the 6th edition, we're into 15 principles, 15 important patterns. Sometimes, unfortunately, researchers don't pay attention to those, and they will criticize R&R, risk-need-responsivity, for being too focused on risk. And they don't bother reading that we have another principle in there about the importance of strengths and how they can be used.
You and I spoke a few years back, and you noted what we commonly refer to as the Big Four. You referenced the Central Eight, and again, we talk about the Big Four as those are even more impactful, or those that are the most impactful on change. But as part of that conversation, we were talking about the evolving research and some evidence that we may be rethinking this in terms of really the big two. It's that criminal thinking, that criminal orientation, if you will, and also companions. Can you maybe speak to that? Is that the trend we're seeing, or is that too much of an oversimplification? Or what are your thoughts on, again, the value of really targeting those two criminogenic areas?
Yeah, well, first of all, as I outlined in the 6th edition at the beginning, I have gotten away from the Big Four, right? And there's a few reasons for that. One is, in earlier editions of the book, we relied heavily on Paul Gendreau's meta-analysis in criminology on the prediction of recidivism, where he outlined various groups, criminal history, and so on. And in terms of effect sizes, we had the Big Four, right? Criminal history, antisocial attitudes, companions, and the like. But back when he published that paper, I think it was 1996, in meta-analyses, people were not using confidence intervals to help them identify what is really significantly more important than another group of predictors. Since then, we've come a far way. And when I look at the evidence, and I've done a number of meta-analyses with mentally disordered offenders, we have meta-analyses on youthful offenders and other groups. And when we look at the data there, the confidence intervals overlap. When you get a list of the Central Eight, sex offenders, whatever, they will overlap, meaning that one group, such as substance abuse, is not significantly more important than companions, right? And that's why in the 6th edition, I no longer talk about the Big Four. It's simply the Central Eight. Now, coming back to where are we going? And I think my involvement in the development of the training program STIX for probation officer has a lot to do with my current thinking, and maybe we'll talk about STIX later. But I think that the thinking, the pro-criminal attitudes, the values are what might be really critical, especially from a practice point of view. That if you're going to help people change, you really have to look at what are their thoughts behind this, and can we change those thoughts? So, when you look at pro-criminal attitudes, it's very simple there. The thoughts are direct. Those rationalizations, techniques of neutralization. It's okay to steal. I have to feed my family. Everybody sees that link. But what about when you're looking at relationships with women? You need to look at the attitudes underneath there. So the central 8, family, marital, employment, what's driving those? It's the thinking underneath. Oh, why should I go out looking for a job and work? There's easier ways to get money. So what if I drink a case of beer once a night? What's the big deal? I'm just relaxing. So, that's where I'm moving towards that. And I hope that people who are practitioners see that this is something that they can actually use, help the client identify the thought underlying a central 8 criminogenic need, and use cognitive behavioral techniques to help change that thinking. So instead of saying it's okay to steal, the guy's insured, start thinking, well, it's not quite okay to steal. I don't know for sure the person's insured. They may have saved lots of money and now they're out of pocket. They'll never be able to replace that, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned tips for the practitioner. I sometimes think there's a bigger disconnect, if you will, between assessment and that case plan process. And I know with the iteration from the LSIR to the LSCMI, that was one of those goals, was to make this more of that case management tool. Do you have tips for the practitioner that, again, around case planning, around the central 8, just to make that process more seamless, or even how to operationalize the needs principle a bit more effectively?
Yeah, it's I agree with you that sometimes, or many times, there's this disconnect between the assessment and case planning. And, in an early study, that's what really struck me. We looked at probation officers in Manitoba. They were doing a risk-need assessment, and then we asked them to audio record their sessions. And, of course, what we found was there was very little relationship between the assessment and what they did with their clients. There was almost no adherence to the risk principle. They're, seeing low-risk people as often as high-risk people. They were not talking about offender criminogenic needs, and they weren't using at all cognitive behavioral helping techniques. And that's why in the LSCMI, we developed that case management plan that goes along with the assessment. My view was in Manitoba, probation officers were assessing the offender dutifully, like policy required them, and then they put it into a filing cabinet, and the client comes in and they fly by the seat of their pants, And of course, I recall inmates coming in to see me. They were constantly in crisis. and you got sucked into their world of a crisis and never got around to dealing with the criminogenic needs that needed to change, so they didn't come back to see me.
You mentioned sticks earlier. Practice models have been more in vogue as of late. Let's talk about your collaboration with Guy Bourgogne and others, the sticks model. Can you share some of those experiences and lessons learned for our audience?
Yeah. Getting into sticks was interesting, and I'll talk about Guy and Tanya Ruggie and others. And it was that Manitoba project that showed the disconnect between assessment and intervention. And really, when you look at it, I used to have training, and I would talk about the importance of pro-criminal attitudes. And probation officers were great in recognizing pro-criminal attitudes. And then I would ask for a show of hands. Okay, you know what it is. How do you change it? Show me. Give me a show of hands. How do you do it? Nobody knows how to do it, right? Probation staff don't get this kind of training when they go to correctional officers school. They get training on how to write a pre-sentence report and how to issue a warrant for an arrest. That kind of stuff. So at the time, I was Director of Corrections Research for Public Safety Canada, right? So I was in the federal government. It was a wonderful, wonderful job. And one of the perks about that job was I had a mandate to work with the provinces in promoting, developing good corrections. The Correctional Service of Canada was separate from my role. That was for federal inmates serving more than 2 years. They had their own research department. At the time when I started, it was Frank Porporino, then later Larry Motiak. So when I presented to the heads of probation from across the country this Manitoba study of probation officers not being effective in their work, not being able to follow the risk-need-responsivity principles, everybody around the table agreed, yeah, it probably applies in our jurisdiction too. So I got that agreement, and then I proposed, listen, how about if I put together a training package with my colleagues to train probation officers to follow these principles more effectively? Do I have any volunteers? So I had 3 provinces volunteer, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Prince Edward Island on the East Coast. So great. I had some volunteers, had to get back to Ottawa and develop a program that made sense and we hope would be effective. And by then, I had hired Guy Bourgogne to come and work with me. Guy had extensive clinical experience. He still sees clients, right? He still does that. So he was already there, and another close colleague, Tanya Ruggie, who had worked with me for a number of years, came on board. And essentially the 3 of us developed a STICS training model. It was essentially 3 days of training. We had different modules on teaching probation officers how to identify criminogenic needs, the importance of pro-criminal attitudes, identify them, and most importantly, we taught them how to apply cognitive intervention techniques to promote pro-social thinking. And we tested it out on those 3 provinces. We had volunteer probation officers. We asked them to audio record their sessions, right? We reviewed files. So we had a pretty good idea whether or not they were doing what we were hoping they would do. And as it turned out, they did, from the audio recordings. They were much better. This was a randomized experiment. So, for example, the control probation officers showed absolutely no evidence of cognitive behavioral techniques, while the ones trained showed more evidence. And this actually translated into reduced recidivism, 2-year follow-up. Now, we had done a couple of other studies in the country. The most recent one, the most important one in my view, was our implementation of STICS in the province of British Columbia. Right? Here, no more volunteers, right? The provincial director said, this is going to be our new way of doing business. We have an estimate from our treasury people that we can save X millions of dollars because of reduced recidivism. Everybody is involved. This is like a vaccine passport. If you want your job, you got to participate. So we trained 350 probation officers. We did a large evaluation that we published earlier this year. We found changes in officer behaviors, pre and post, clear changes. And we found reduced general recidivism and, for the first time, reduced violent recidivism. We never looked at violent recidivism prior to that. So we had, it was a 4-year project, with Guy, myself, Tanya, going out, doing training workshops. We would rotate because we were going out every 4 to 5 weeks to British Columbia. And so sometimes it would be Guy and I and a couple of other people. Sometimes it would be Tanya and Guy. But the 3 of us were almost always at every single training. And that was a hugely fun time, going out, working with the probation officers. I'm an old clinician and I no longer do clinical practice, but working with probation officers on the clients they see, it was vicarious clinical intervention for me. It was fabulous.
Yeah, I encourage folks to research the STICS model. It really is something to see and learn more about. And long-term listeners of the show will know that I interviewed Guy way back when. So there's an old podcast episode of The Criminologist, which I'm sure Guy talks about STICS. And then also related to STICS, I did an entire episode highlighting Spot the Dog, which I thought was a brilliant way for the team to, again, get the client to understand the thought behavior link, which, as you know, is critical in the change process. And again, I just thought that Spot the Dog exercise was brilliant. So I did an entire episode on that as well. You talked about sort of your joie de vivre, getting out with practitioners and rolling up your sleeves and getting back in the trenches. I was recently in Barcelona training probation staff from around Europe on core correctional skills, and I met all sorts of evidence-based practice kindred spirits, including Ana Cristina Neves from Portugal. She's a master YLS trainer. She's trained in LSI. I noted to her that I would be interviewing you and asked if she had any questions. And so I would like to present those questions on behalf of Anna. She wrote, when you were in Portugal more than 10 years ago, you left an important message to practitioners. When working with offenders, don't forget to be nice. Do you think the developments in evidence-based practice have been able to incorporate this message? How important have training programs, such as the STIX model, been to assure human relationships are not left behind in correctional practices?
Well, first of all, if Christina is listening, I'd just like to say hello. And I remember meeting you, and it was more than 10 years ago. Now, as to your question, well, maybe I did say be nice. I think I would have said something like that. I want to point out that when you look at the R&R expanded model, the very first principle that we outline is respect for the person. Show respect for the person. The R&R model has been criticized as being too negative or harsh, too risk-focused. But the idea of being nice, showing respect for the person, is not only in the expanded R&R model that goes back to at least the 5th edition, but even if you go back to the first edition of the Psychology Conduct, go read chapter 1 again. We talk about the humane, respectful approach to working with offenders. So that's an underlying theme in Don's work and my work and many of my colleagues. And in terms of these new practice training programs, I think one of the reasons we have these training programs is that people are realizing that clients need our help. And to give our help, that means being respectful. If we didn't care about our clients, we wouldn't have these training programs, right? We would just have probation officers driving around doing home checks and urine checks and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But these new programs reflect, I think, a new positive approach to our offenders. And in STIX, one of our modules deals with rapport building, the importance that if you want to have your client willing to change their behavior, listen to what you have to say. They have to like you, first of all. They have to respect you, and you respect them. So we have actual training and building rapport, being non-judgmental, and get involved with active listening, respectful feedback. So it's there. And Christina, thank you for your question.
Yes, and to your point, whether it's rapport building or engagement or adherence to or awareness of a working alliance, to your point, that relationship piece is critical for any of these other evidence-based practices to take hold. She also asked, how do you feel when you see the risk-need-responsivity principles being incorporated in recommendations from literally around the world? She sees that in recommendations coming out of the Council of Europe. But again, am aware that R&R is practiced around the world. What is that feeling like?
Well, I can't deny it feels good. Personally, that myself and others, we spent our whole careers in developing, studying, understanding the R&R principles. But I hope that what it also means is that many jurisdictions are increasingly respectful of the evidence, asking the question, what is the evidence for this? If we're going to do a new way of working with our clients, what is the evidence? Can we go forward? And where we see more and more R&R practice, I believe that reflects people's belief that there's evidence for this, and it's fairly solid evidence. So let's go forward. Let's not, as Ed Latessa and others, Paul Gendreau, Frank Cullen, would talk about correctional quackery, right? Right. Respect the evidence, and if you do that, I think then you're doing the best you can.
We've talked about both the LSAR and the LSCMI and that difference between the third and fourth generation tools. Do you see the emergence of a fifth generation risk need assessment or what sort of future developments do you see with the LSCMI?
Yeah, I know in the 6th edition of the book, I kind of mused about what might be fifth generation, and I think I just kind of threw out there perhaps in the inclusion of some neuropsychological markers. There's a lot of evidence from functional MRI studies and things that certain kind of brain activity may make some more susceptible to going along the path of crime. Whether or not that develops, I think, will depend on how inexpensive and simple you can make these markers. Right now, if you're doing an fMRI study, that's horrendously expensive. And you need highly skilled professional people to administer it. And so far, I don't think we're anywhere near a point of simple assessments of psychoneurological markers. Now, with the future of the LSCMI, it's interesting. When we published the LSCMI, Don and Steve and I were hoping that people would jump on the other sections of the LSCMI, Section 2, potential, criminogenic needs, the responsivity subsections. But most of the research, except for a few studies by Steve, have ignored these other sections. So first of all, I would like to have more empirical data on the value of sections 2 and the responsivity ones. So if there are researchers listening to this, I would really encourage you, please do some research on it. The one area where I would like to see some expansion is on the assessment of responsivity in the LSCMI. The LSCMI now is almost a little bit more than 15 years old. And yes, it was new at the time when we published it, but I think it could be expanded, become more important. We have research on, for example, women trailers to the LSIs. Can we look at those? Can they be embedded into the LSCMI better? I've been encouraged. I plan to do a LinkedIn post on a recent virtual presentation I did for the Japanese Society of Criminology. And in the question and answer section, they raised a really interesting question to me that got me thinking in more detail about the role of trauma, right? Typically, look at trauma as a responsivity factor. Childhood trauma, it's there. It's a predictor of criminal behavior, but it's a static factor. But trauma has effects, right? Post-traumatic stress. We have distrust in other people as a result. Anxiety results from them. Can we better assess some of these effects of childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and incorporate them in our assessment somehow? Yes, these responsivity factors are important in how we go about developing case plans and intervening with our clients. So this may be something that we may consider in the future as the evidence accumulates.
Yes, I know, as you noted, the issue of trauma, and you mentioned adverse childhood experiences and how that interplays with the current R&R model is hotly discussed right now. And to your point, if there's a young researcher out there listening, or somebody who's willing to look at all these variables and continue to come up with that more holistic approach to helping our clients change, that would be the next horizon. Dr. Bonta, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you being on the show. I will leave a link for the psychology of criminal conduct in the episode description of this podcast for individuals looking to track that down. I encourage them all to do so. And I look forward to that LinkedIn post coming up and seeing what else is on the horizon. I appreciate your infinite mindset, Jim.
Thank you very much, Joe. It was a pleasure.
All right. We'll talk soon. Have a great day.
Okay. Bye.
Tired of those pesky risk factors? Fed up with those nagging periods of reoffending? Just can't seem to keep on the straight and narrow? Then try CriminoGuard. CriminoGuard is our patented repellent against criminogenic need. CriminoGuard is effective against the risk factors of delinquent past, dysfunctional family relationships, substance misuse, lack of pro-social leisure activities, deficits around education and employment, negative peers, pro-criminal attitude, and a history of antisocial personality pattern. Simply apply CriminoGuard at the onset of delinquent behavior and when actuarial risk assessment warrants application. CriminoGuard works by attacking criminogenic need at the source while buffering against future risk. Inspired by general personality and cognitive social learning theory, CriminoGuard identifies criminogenic need at its source. Then our top secret byproducts mimic pro-social modeling to elicit the onset of pro-social behavior. Once the costs for antisocial behavior outweigh the rewards, users begin seeing reductions in criminal deeds. CriminoGuard is available in regular, mint, or jasmine scent. Find CriminoGuard at all quality vendors, shops, and strip malls. CriminoGuard is not a substitute for proven evidence-based practices. CriminoGuard may cause mild discomfort or skin rash. In case of continued maladaptive behavior, users should subject themselves to proven core correctional practices. CriminoGuard has failed to result in significant effect sizes in recidivism reduction. Buyer beware, not sold in Canada. Big thank you once again to Jim Bonta for sharing his insights with us. I have left a link for the Psychology of Criminal Conduct text in the show description of this episode. I highly encourage all of you aspiring correctional professionals, probation, parole officers to obtain and read that textbook. If you are interested in learning more about the STIX practice model, which Dr. Bonta was an integral part of, go back and check out episode 18, in which I interviewed Dr. Guy Burgon, who was also a force behind the STIX model. We also referenced the great Spot the Dog exercise, which came about while implementing STIX. Again, that was the exercise designed to get clients to understand and embrace the thought-behavior link, which we know is foundational in cognitive behavioral interventions. That was episode 24, if you want to go back, where I model the Spot the Dog interview. Check that out. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. Dr. Alex Walker will be in the house. So excited to talk to her. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices, implementation, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and our Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You can also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is now available. If you are looking for some criminologist swag, please reach out to the show. And if you believe in what we're doing, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the show, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
I think I was born with horseshoes, you know where.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.